Okay, MMO players love to advocate for freedom, until I realize freedom means thinking for themselves and putting a great amount of effort into their idea that might not work as well as they'd hoped. That's when they drop their creativity like a toddler flinging vegetables and check a spreadsheet, copy whatever some guy named DPS God 420 says was best, and call it a day. And if you think I'm exaggerating, we've all been there. But trust me, I was there a few nights ago. I rolled need on a sword in the forge, and you'd think I looted a child's Make-A-Wish reward the way that the party reacted when I did. It didn't matter that I was actually using one-handed swords in my build. The spreadsheet goblins had already decided I was playing the game incorrectly. And that's a challenge that I want to discuss about Ashes of Creation today. With 64 class combinations, a secondary archetype system, and open weapon choices, Ashes is promising the most build freedom we've ever seen in an MMO. The devs are practically screaming, go wild, experiment, forge your own path. But we know how this all ends. The moment a mathematically superior build is discovered, every other option will get shoved into a shallow grave, trampled by a stampede of meta-chasing lemmings. Try something off-meta and it doesn't matter if it works. You could be topping the DPS charts, which there won't be in Ashes as far as Steven's concerned, or out-healing the clerics, or tanking in a bathrobe. None of it will save you from the side-eyes, the snide comments, and the inevitable boot from the party, because you're not playing the game correctly. So today, we're cutting through the illusion of choice and asking the real question. Can Ashes of Creation, can Intrepid, actually break the cycle? Or is this just another MMO where players say that build diversity exists until the meta dictates otherwise? Ashes of Creation is selling us a dream. A world where you can mix and match 8 different archetypes to create 64 unique class combinations. Casters in heavy armor, rangers with spellbooks, and a bard that might actually fight instead of just standing there as a mana battery. It's all possible. And on paper, this system's beautiful. The secondary archetype doesn't give you new skills, it just modifies the ones you already have, by adding effects that change how your class actually plays. We of course don't have any details on that, but a rogue cleric might have life-stealing daggers, a tank mage could throw magic-infused shields, and if Intrepid really leans into it, a bard fighter might just destroy enemies while playing a banjo. But here's the thing. Balancing 64 different class combinations isn't just difficult, it's a nightmare. Intrepid isn't just trying to create variety, they're fighting against a fundamental truth of MMOs. Players don't just experiment, they optimize. The moment one build is even slightly more efficient, everything else becomes irrelevant. And yet, here's the contradiction. Players love the idea of making their characters unique. The ability to forge an unconventional build that still holds its own is incredibly appealing. But that freedom only matters if the community is willing to accept that off-meta doesn't mean ineffective. If players recognize that multiple builds can be viable, we might actually see true diversity instead of the usual follow the meta or get left behind routine. So the real question isn't whether Ashes can offer diverse builds, it's whether the community will allow other players to use them. You see, players claim that they want freedom, but the unfortunate truth is that many don't. They like the idea of freedom. They like to imagine themselves as rogue geniuses crafting unique builds that defy convention. But the moment one build is even slightly more efficient, every other option gets discarded. Like a roadkill raccoon left in the sun for a week. Bloated, leaking, and very much not worth keeping around. Because here is how it always goes. Step 1. The game launches with a buffet of build options, and for a brief, glorious moment, maybe a couple of weeks, people actually experiment. Wild ideas, hybrid setups, utter madness, it's completely beautiful. Step 2. Some spreadsheet-wielding metagoblin emerges from the darkness, crunches the numbers, and declares one build slightly more efficient than the rest. Step 3. Guides flood the internet. The illusion of choice shatters like a house of cards in a hurricane, and suddenly, what was once a sandbox of creativity is just another standardized test where there's only one right answer. Step 4. The meta becomes law. And if you're not following it, you might as well be showing up to a job interview in clown shoes. Memorable, but immediately dismissed. This isn't just speculation, it's MMO history on repeat. World of Warcraft has spent 2 decades balancing classes, yet off-meta players are still treated like they showed up to raid night with a fork and a prayer instead of a weapon. Final Fantasy XIV claims every job is viable, but if you don't pick the mathematically optimal setup, you might as well be trying to DPS with interpretive dance. Elder Scrolls Online actively promotes hybrid play, yet the moment someone picks an unconventional weapon, the DPS meters light up like a red alarm and suddenly it's a crime scene. And Ashes of Creation is about to walk straight into this meat grinder. With 64 class combinations, Ashes could have the most diverse build system in MMO history, but that only matters if players actually use it. If they fall into the same old cycle, chasing spreadsheets instead of fun, then all of Intrepid's grand ambitions will rot in the same mass grave as every other MMO's promises of build freedom. So the real question isn't, will Ashes have a meta? Because it will. Of course it will. The real question is, will the meta choke out build diversity before it even gets a chance to breathe? Will Ashes players embrace variety, or will they, like every other MMO community before them, keep forcing every off-meta build into exile? At the end of the day, build diversity isn't killed by developers, it's killed by the players. You can have 64 class combinations, open weapon choices, and a secondary archetype system designed for variety, but none of that matters if the community refuses to accept anything outside of the meta. And like I said before, I got a front row seat to this problem. A few nights ago, I was part of a forge raid, looking for glittering strands and bow recipes. I didn't get any bow recipes or bows, but I did walk away with a glittering strand and, more importantly, a heroic Khadgar from the last boss. Now, my build is focused on dexterity and attack speed, even though the established wisdom of the alpha test says I should be stacking strength instead. Currently, I use a rare steel energy focus, and before I replaced it, I had a Kingfisher Slasher build, and then enchanted to +2. So when I rolled need on that Khadgar and won it with a 68, I was absolutely hyped. The rest of the pug, however, not so much. According to them, it was a tank sword, or meant for fighters, and not someone like me. Another ranger had rolled greed instead of need and instantly regretted it after seeing that I rolled need. And no matter how much I explained that I was actually using a one-handed sword at the time and a focus, nobody could believe what they were hearing. My DPS was fine up until that point. I wasn't holding the team back, but all of a sudden, me using a one-handed sword didn't matter. To them, I wasn't playing the game correctly. And just like that, I was excommunicated from the raid leader's good graces. My name might as well be etched in their guilds of do not resuscitate list, because my chances of getting another invite to that group, to that forge group, died on that loot roll. Maybe it was just jealousy on their part, but the ugly truth of MMOs is that the meta isn't just a guide, it's a social contract. It dictates who gets what gear, who gets invites, and who gets kicked to the curb. Even in a game that's built to support multiple playstyles, players will still judge you for rolling on an item they don't think belongs to you. So, if Ashes of Creation is ever going to break this cycle, or if they have a chance to break this cycle, it won't be because of balance patches or dev updates. It'll be because players decide that build diversity is actually worth defending. If people can accept that off-meta doesn't mean useless, then maybe, just maybe, we'll see a world where someone can pick up a one-handed sword as a ranger without being treated like they just drop-kicked a puppy in front of the entire party. The hardest thing to change in an MMO isn't the balance, the builds, or even the content. It's the players. For years, MMO players have been trained like Pavlov's dog to believe that there is only one right way to play a game. Not because the devs forced them to do it, but because efficiency culture took over everything. The moment a single build is even marginally better, every other option gets treated like gas station sushi. Technically edible, but you're going to mock the people who choose to eat it every time. And that's a real challenge that Intrepid is up against. Not balancing 64 classes and not making sure that every weapon feels viable, but convincing players that more than one option can be good. Because right now, the average MMO player would rather blindly follow a meta guide written by some guy whose entire personality is an anime profile than actually experiment for themselves. And if Ashes wants to change that mentality, it's going to take more than a perfectly balanced game. It's going to take an entire community shift. That said, if Intrepid wants to help, they have only one real tool: balance. They can't force players to accept build diversity, but they can, to the best of their ability, make sure diverse builds actually work. The more evenly classes and abilities are balanced, the harder it is for a single meta to dominate everything. If they do their job right, if they manage to pull it off, players will have actual choices instead of just a false sense of freedom with only one real option. But at the end of the day, the only way build diversity survives is if players let go of the idea that off-meta means bad, if they start valuing playstyle over raw math, if they stop treating group content like a corporate hiring process where only the most qualified builds get the job. So here's the real question: can players unlearn bad habits they picked up from every other MMO? Or are we just doomed to another decade of spreadsheet warriors dictating how we play? So, where does this leave us? We've already seen how players, not devs, are the real gatekeepers of build diversity. We've seen how efficiency culture turns choice into an illusion. And we've seen how even in a game built to encourage variety, the moment a meta emerges, everything else gets tossed aside like last week's leftovers. Here's the reality check. Intrepid can give players options, but it can't make players use them. The devs can balance the numbers, but they can't balance people's mindsets. At the end of the day, breaking free from meta slavery is a choice, and it sure as hell isn't one that the devs can make for players. And that means Ashes can go one of two ways. Option 1. Players fall into the same old habits, blindly following whatever build guide floats to the top of the subreddit, judging off-meta players before they even see what they can do. The game promises 64 class combinations, but in reality, only 5 of them matter. Option 2. People actually think for themselves and start judging builds based on what works and not what a spreadsheet says should work. They realize that off-meta doesn't mean bad, it just means different. And maybe, just maybe, we end up with a game where someone can roll need on an unconventional weapon without being thrown into MMO exile. The choice isn't up to the devs. They can only do so much. But it's up to every single player who has to decide whether to play the game or to let the game play them. Because Ashes of Creation isn't just testing build diversity, it's testing the players. And if they don't get it, then congratulations, we just spent a decade waiting for the next evolution of MMOs, only for players to keep chasing the meta like a cult blindly following their leader, never questioning, never thinking, just mindlessly going through the motions until every build looks the same and diversity dies at the hands of the spreadsheet goblins. That's all for today. You're welcome.